What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Friday, you know what time it is. It's time to get into those wide receiver start and sits as we head into the first week of the playoffs. First off, I just want to give a big shout out to you guys. Congratulations for making it this far. This season, more than ever, has had a lot of adversity. I don't think there's been one team in all of my leagues that hasn't dealt with injuries. Throw COVID on top of that, and it's safe to say things this year are unlike we've ever seen before. Let's not lose focus though. The goal, of course, isn't to make it into the playoffs. Our goal is to get that championship. Us at Fantasy Football Advice, we want to help you in every way possible. So for the remainder of the season, our website is completely free. That's right, waiver information, the rankings, even the sports betting picks, and daily fantasy information is available for everybody. All we ask in return, like this video, subscribe if you have not, and if you haven't yet checked out the website, what are you waiting for? Link in the description box below. With that being said though, let's get into the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which player led the league in air yards in week 13. The correct answer was actually Marvin Jones. Congratulations to Matthew Johnson, you got this one right. As for today's stat of the day, which quarterback has currently attempted the most deep passes on the season? Once again, that's which QB is currently leading the league in deep pass attempts. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Without further ado, let's hop right into the first matchup. We have the Houston Texans on the road against the Chicago Bears. Starting with Chicago, the only receiver of note, of course, Allen Robinson. In this matchup, he should be considered a safe floor, high-end wide receiver too. When it comes to A-Rob, he has all of the talent in the world, but the only thing really holding him back is this offense. For several weeks now, we've seen A-Rob hit his floor as opposed to his ceiling. The last time he scored a receiving touchdown was all the way back in week 8. Fear not though, I did say he does have a safe floor because Robinson, even when switching quarterbacks, hasn't had a game with 5 or less receptions since all the way back in week 7. One thing to take note of though is that the Houston Texans, they have been playing a bit better on defense. So although this was once one of the premier matchups for the wide receiver position, the odds of Allen Robinson pulling it together, scoring 20-30 points, while it is in his range of outcomes, it's simply not a realistic expectation. But regardless, he's one of the safest wide receiver 2s you could possibly ask for. And in the playoffs where we need players to put up points, we really can't afford duds. When it comes to A-Rob, barring injury, we already know what we can expect. On the other side of the ball, for Houston, we have 2 wide receivers in consideration. The first, of course, Brandon Cooks. With the suspension of Will Fuller, he should serve as the primary receiver in this offense. Unfortunately, last week we really didn't see it. That was, of course, in a really difficult matchup. The Indianapolis Colts are one of the best defenses at defending opposing wide receivers, and unfortunately for him, we have a similar situation this week. The Chicago Bears have actually been more efficient on the season at defending opposing wide receiver 1s. So Brandon Cooks, while he is stepping into a major opportunity share without Will Fuller, we really can't head into this week expecting similar production from him. For that reason, we do have him ranked as a back-end wide receiver 2. As for Kuti, yes, he's coming off of a monster performance, but we can't forget it's win or go home in the playoffs. For that reason, it's difficult for us to trust a player like Kiki Kuti as anything more than a flex in this matchup. It has a very low projected total at 45 points. The Texans, they're also road favorites in this one. So for me, I'm trying to start the players that got me here as opposed to the hottest thing off the waiver wire. Moving over to the next matchup, we have the Minnesota Vikings on the road against the Buccaneers. If there was one game that I could say has the safest potential to shoot out, for me, it's definitely this game. Both of these teams, they rank in the bottom 10 at defending opposing fantasy receivers. This game also comes with one of the highest projected totals on the week at 51.5 points. In Minnesota, while typically a run-first team, they've been passing the ball a ton. Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen, they're going to feast once again this week. There should be absolutely no reason reason we're leaving them on the bench. They're coming into this matchup as a touchdown underdog. So as much as they could want to run the ball, the option of doing that late in this game is much less likely than it would be in other matchups. On the other side of the ball for Tampa Bay, both Mike Evans and Chris Godwin have a ton of upside in this matchup, both of which you can safely start them as mid-grade wide receiver 2s. When it comes to upside, we're definitely giving the edge to Mike Evans, who's been a red zone threat for this offense over the past few weeks. But when it comes to safety, Chris Godwin, he's really your guy. As for Antonio Brown though, he's definitely more the player you want to put in the flex. We're always shooting for upside with that position, and when it comes to Antonio Brown, a player with a much lower floor than the other receivers in this offense, it has absolutely no impact on his potential to completely pop off, which when it comes to Antonio Brown could be at any week. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Tennessee Titans versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Starting with the Titans, the big news in this one is of course the question marks when it comes to the health of AJ Brown. If you are an AJ Brown owner, I'm definitely suggesting to plan to be without him. This is of course very unfortunate news. The Jacksonville Jaguars are a terrible pass defense. AJ Brown in this matchup was probably going to pop off, but his loss is definitely a gain for Corey Davis. Davis leading this team from the wide receiver position in week 13. He posted 12 targets, 11 receptions, 182 receiving yards, and even scored a touchdown. If AJ Brown is ruled out, Corey Davis has a similar ceiling this week. Keep in mind though, the Tennessee Titans were playing from behind that entire game. The Tennessee Titans were also without Jonnu Smith, so there are some variables that were working in his favor. He won't have, of course, this week, but regardless, Corey Davis is a solid wide receiver too, whether AJ Brown plays in this game or not. On the other side of the ball for Jacksonville, we really can't trust any of these receivers. Like I mentioned in my last video, Laviska Shenault, his touchdown, it's been fluky. Colin Johnson, while he's been the most productive, his production could fall off at any moment. So if it were up to me, I'd prefer to not start any of these receivers. We haven't been relying on them for the entire season, but if you're a player in a desperate situation, the only one we could realistically suggest starting is DJ Chark, based off his talent, based off of his health trending upward, and his skill set matches up very well with the weaknesses of the Jacksonville defense. The next matchup, we have Dallas Cowboys versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Starting with Dallas, we have Amari Cooper, also CeeDee Lamb, two players you could definitely trust in this matchup. The floor for each of these players is going to be a bit lower than it typically would. Dallas, they aren't going to be playing from behind. Cincinnati, while loaded with talent, similarly to Dallas, they have a lack of competence at the QB position. Dallas heading into this one though is still a road favorite, which if that scenario does hold true, the passing volume late in the game may not be as high as it typically would be. This game also has a very low projected total at 43.5 points. So even though Amari Cooper has now scored in back-to-back games, the odds of him making a three-peat out of it, it's a bit less likely. So consider him more of a high floor option as opposed to a high ceiling receiver. We have him ranked as a back-end wide receiver 2. As for CeeDee Lamb, you can safely start him as a wide receiver 3 or a flex player. He's been getting the volume, the production hasn't really followed suit, but if there was a matchup for him to potentially hit his ceiling, this is definitely one of those games. As for Michael Gallup, I understand he completely popped off last week. We're not in the business of chasing fantasy points though, so I'd suggest leave him on your bench. Even better, drop him to the waiver wire, because Gallup is the perfect example of the type of player to potentially post a trap game. People will be chasing those fantasy points, so I prefer to let my opponent try and chase them, because we've seen a large enough sample size with Michael Gallup to know what we're getting. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Arizona Cardinals versus the New York Giants. This one is super simple, so we can gloss over it. There really aren't any starters that we can trust in this matchup outside of DeAndre Hopkins. Hopkins, of course, is a bona fide wide receiver 1. He's an auto start. You don't need me to tell you that. But on the other side of the ball, Sterling Shepard, Darius Slayton, this really isn't the matchup we're trying to get them in. As it stands, Daniel Jones is projected to start, and while that is a boost to all of the weapons on this offense, it's really not a positive defensive matchup for any of these wide receivers. We don't have any of them ranked as even flex starters, so we'll move right into the next one. Denver Broncos versus the Carolina Panthers. Big news in this one, of course, is both DJ Moore, Curtis Samuel, both receivers unlikely to play, paving the way for Robbie Anderson to have a really safe floor with a massive amount of upside. We have him ranked inside the top 20, making him one of the more polarizing wide receiver 2s on the week. It's not the best matchup. Teddy Bridgewater, he's not quite himself, but the potential to be without Christian McCaffrey, DJ Moore, and Curtis Samuel means there's virtually no chance that Robbie Anderson busts for your team. The next matchup we have Kansas City Chiefs versus the Miami Dolphins. In this game, we already know the only two players we're considering at this point, Devontae Parker, Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill, of course, a top 5 wide receiver each and every week. But as for Devontae Parker, who some of you may be wondering if you're starting him or not, Kansas City is, of course, one of the better defenses we try not to start our receivers against, but he's been a target monster regardless of which quarterback's starting. We know the Miami Dolphins are likely to be playing from behind late in this game, opening the door for a lot of garbage time production. So when it comes to Parker, even though the risk of him hitting his floor is a bit higher than it typically would be, his ceiling will more than make up for it. We have him ranked inside the top 24, making him more of a back-end wide receiver 2. Don't let that ranking fool you though, he definitely has wide receiver 1 upside in this matchup. Moving into the next game, we have the Las Vegas Raiders versus the Indianapolis Colts. When it comes to this game, there really aren't any high-end options. For the Raiders, we can't even recommend starting anybody. Henry Ruggs, the most talented receiver, has not been getting the volume needed to support consistent fantasy production. The Indianapolis Colts are also a difficult matchup, so any receiver on this team outside of Darren Waller should definitely be left on the bench. As for Indianapolis though, there are 2 receivers in contention, starting with the hottest one on this roster. It's definitely T.Y. Hilton. A slow start may have forced him to the waivers, but he's coming off of his best game of the season, 11 targets, 8 receptions, 110 yards, and even a receiving touchdown. This is now back-to-back games in which he has reached pay dirt, so he's trending upward in a matchup against a defense trending down. Just last week, Sam Darnold had one of his best passing games, and the Raiders have also allowed multi-TD games to a wide receiver on 4 different occasions this season. So this week, T.Y. Hilton, while he doesn't rank inside our top 30, he's definitely an upside player inside our top 36 that we would love to have in our flex. As for Michael Pittman, his volume, it's been inconsistent. This is a plus matchup. He definitely has a good shot to score, but his ceiling, it's not as high as that of T.Y. Hilton's, and his floor is very similar to those in this range. Consider him a moderate floor, moderate upside player we have ranked outside the top 40, but in a desperate situation, we could understand playing him, but personally, I prefer a different option. Moving into the next matchup, we have the New York Jets versus the Seattle Seahawks. As we know, the Seattle Seahawks are a premier matchup for all wide receivers. This is going to be a major boost to players like Brashad Perriman and Jamison Crowder. Unfortunately though, they do have Sam Darnold throwing them the ball, which means even in a plus matchup, there is still a significant amount of risk. But with Denzel Mims already ruled out, the odds of Crowder or Perriman actually busting is even lower than it typically would be, and the upside that comes along with this matchup makes both of them really solid starts. If I'm going for safety, I'd bet on Crowder, but if I need sheer upside, I'm facing an opponent who's projected to destroy me, I'm putting Perriman in, hoping for the best because we know he has the ability to completely pop off. The next matchup we have the Green Bay Packers versus the Detroit Lions. This one very simple for Green Bay. Devontae Adams is an auto lock each and every week, and while Allen Lazard, we would like to avoid starting him if we have better options. If you do need to start him in the flex, this is a solid matchup to do so. The Detroit Lions are not only one of the worst defenses at defending opposing wide receivers, they've also over the past 4 weeks been competing to allow the most receptions to the position, and Allen Lazard has left no questions as to who the next best receiver on this offense is. MVS, his role has completely diminished, so if there is another receiver outside of Davante Adams to be able to produce, it's definitely Allen Lazard, so we have zero issues starting him in the flex. As for Detroit, they're planning to be without Kenny Golladay, once again making Marvin Jones a pretty solid start. Marvin Jones is now coming off of back-to-back games with 12 targets. Any receiver getting that amount of volume is going to warrant a start regardless of how strong the defense is. The Packers definitely fall into that category of strong passing defenses. Regardless though, this 55 projected point total coupled with the lack of receiving targets in this offense makes Marvin Jones a top 30 option this week. The Detroit Lions are coming into this game as nearly a touchdown underdog, so the potential of garbage time production, an area Marvin Jones excels in, it's pretty high, so in turn Marvin Jones' ceiling is high as well. The next matchup we have Atlanta Falcons versus the LA Chargers. This game has a moderate total at 49 points. We definitely expect a get right game for Justin Herbert, who's coming off of his worst performance on the season. It is worth noting that the Atlanta Falcons have been tightening things up a bit, but that factor is almost irrelevant when it comes to Keenan Allen, who's received double-digit targets in 6 of his last 7 games. The only question on this LA Chargers offense as to which receiver we're actually starting, that comes from trusting Mike Williams or not. While yes, he is coming off of a 9-target game, tying his season high, while that is a positive sign, it's pretty much irrelevant because the Chargers were getting blown out that entire game. What I will say in his favor though is that this is the softest matchup he's faced all season, so consider Mike Williams a high risk, high reward wide receiver you can start in your flex. On the other side of the ball, Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, both premier starts at the position. You can expect wide receiver 1 numbers despite this being a tough matchup, because if we know one thing about Justin Herbert, it's that he is no stranger to getting in shootouts. If he's able to successfully pick apart this Atlanta Falcons defense, the upside for both Julio as well as Calvin Ridley is extremely high. Ridley has been proving to be more efficient with Julio in the lineup, so as a Ridley owner, you shouldn't be concerned. We have both receivers ranked as mid-grade wide receiver 1s this week. The next matchup we have Washington Football Team versus the San Francisco 49ers. This game has one of the lowest projected totals on the week, so the odds of multiple receivers finding a ton of success. So Terry McLaurin, who's coming off of his worst performance on the season, is going to drop a bit in the rankings. While typically a player who's borderline wide receiver 1, we would feel more comfortable starting him with the expectations of posting wide receiver 2 production, and the same goes double for the San Francisco receivers. Considering the type of defense this is, a player like Brandon Ayuk, he should have a much easier time producing against this stout defense, so he is going to edge out Deebo Samuel in the rankings, but both players top 30 options, but back end ones at that. The next matchup we have New Orleans Saints versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Big news here, Jalen Hurts is the starter. While that does bring a bit more potential for upside for all the receivers in this offense, it's also going to increase the risk. But unfortunately, in this situation, the risk just doesn't outweigh the reward. The Saints have only allowed 1 receiving touchdown to a wide receiver over the past 4 weeks, so I'm not trusting anyone outside of Dallas Goedert. And as for New Orleans, there's really only one player as well. That, of course, is Michael Thomas. We have him ranked inside the top 12, but in a game in which the Eagles are projected to lose by over a touchdown, there's a strong chance this defense could feast against this offense. So Michael Thomas, while still a wide receiver 1, will come into this matchup with a bit of a lower floor. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Buffalo Bills versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. There are several players in this game that people are going to start in the playoffs. We'll start with Stephon Diggs, who's been the best receiver out of anyone playing in this game on the season. So it is a bit unfortunate that he is going to have to face Pittsburgh in the first week of the playoffs. The Pittsburgh Steelers, while at the beginning part of the season were a defense we were targeting for wide receivers, well, since then and more recently, that has completely flipped upside down. Pittsburgh now is a defense we should be avoiding starting wide receivers, meaning both Stephon Diggs and Cole Beasley are going to get a bump down in the rankings. Stephon Diggs we still do have ranked as a high-end wide receiver 2, while typically a wide receiver 1, we only bumped him down a few spots, and that is largely due to the safety in his floor. Diggs has not had a game with fewer than 6 receptions since week 3, and although the Steelers have allowed just 2 receiving touchdowns to wide receivers in the past 4 weeks, the name of the game for Stephon Diggs has not been in the area of receiving touchdowns. As for Cole Beasley, this has been a player more hot and cold. That's the type of player I trust even less in this matchup, so although he is a top 30 receiver on the season, I would prefer to find a safer option. We do still have him ranked though as a flex type starter, one with a bit more volatility than others in this range, so if you value safety, maybe you should pivot elsewhere. On the other side of the ball, for Pittsburgh, Diontae Johnson continues to separate himself. While Juju and Claypool are still solid starters, definitely players I would be thrilled to put in the flex, those 2 players are still borderline top 30 options this week, and Diontae Johnson has undeniable wide receiver 1 upside. Diontae Johnson has now had double-digit targets in each of the last 5 games, double-digit targets in 6 of his last 7, so when it comes to Buffalo, that has allowed a receiving touchdown to a wide receiver in each of the last 4 games, the upside, the safety, Diontae Johnson brings in the entire package. The final game we have, the Baltimore Ravens versus the Cleveland Browns. On the Baltimore side of things, it's pretty simple. Outside of Mark Andrews, we're really not trusting any other receiving option. On the Cleveland side, I do believe people are sleeping on Landry a bit. Landry has already proven to be able to beat this defense, not just last year, but this season as well. In week 1, he posted a game with 5 receptions for 61 yards. We cannot forget this is when Cleveland had their full force of weapons. Kareem Hunt in the receiving game, Odell Beckham as well. Heading into this week, they won't have the luxury of having so many weapons, so Jarvis Landry will almost be forced to play a pivotal role. So contrary to what we typically believe when receivers face Baltimore, I do believe Jarvis Landry has a safe floor in this matchup, and he will remain a top 30 option, one that we really shouldn't be sleeping on his upside. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hoped you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.